Well, good day, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on NATO's southern flank, security around the Mediterranean Sea. I'm E.J. Herold, Executive Director of IISS Americas, the Washington office of London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies. We're pleased to welcome our IISS members to today's discussions. And for the members of the public joining us today, we hope this event will inspire you to join IISS and experience the full range of publications and other benefits that we offer. Today, we're joined by several distinguished panelists. Robert Bell, the CEO of National Security Council, LLC, and formerly the Senior Civilian Representative of the Secretary of Defense in Europe and Defense Advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to NATO from 2010 to 2017. Dr. Chloe Berger, Faculty Advisor and Researcher at the NATO Defense College in Rome, and Rear Admiral Giorgio Lazio, Maritime Commander in the Italian Navy at La Spezia, Italy. Before we begin our conversation, let me take care of some of the housekeeping instructions. Our session today is on the record, and we'll be recording it and placing a link on our website approximately 24 hours after today's session. For those of you who want to ask a question during today's event, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send your questions at any time during the discussion, and I'll do my best to introduce your points into the discussion. Given the number of participants in today's session, I may end up grouping similar questions together for the sake of time, and I will try to do my best to identify the questioners. So now let me start with a short scene setter before we open the discussion. In the first webinar in this series, Competition in the Eastern Mediterranean, Understanding Complex Dimensions and Multiple Players, our panelists discussed the ongoing strategic competition between Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, and others in the region in the context of history, geopolitics, and competition over energy resources. Current tensions and disputes in the region, some of the sharpest in recent memory, are in many ways continuations of old disputes yet unresolved, but also complicated by the discovery of resource deposits and disputed territorial claims on the Mediterranean seabed. For today's discussion, we turn our attention to the broader geostrategic environment of the Mediterranean and consider the impetus of NATO's southern flank strategy and the impact that focus has had on the nations around the Mediterranean basin. While the nations on the Mediterranean littoral have primary responsibility for responding to challenges to their sovereignty, particularly posed by migrant flows, illegal trafficking in drugs, persons, and goods, or competition for resources, once the combined effort to withstand these challenges strains or exceeds national capacities, where do nations turn? On the one hand, the EU claims primacy in economic and security issues. On the other hand, NATO nations also claim these issues fall into the category of defense of their territory, a NATO prerogative. Who's right? And how should the situation be handled? I'd like to open that first question up to our panelists, and who would like to take the first stab at answering that question?
Well, I'm not shy to jump in, EJ.
All right, Robert.
It seems to me it's all of the above. It doesn't have to be either or. The EU, of course, is one of the largest economic entities in the world and huge economic interests to the south, of course, is going to have a foreign policy that looks to the south, among other directions. But for NATO, the treaty talks about a treaty area that's not just dealing with challenges to the east. The treaty area includes North America. The only time Article 5 was invoked, as we all well know, was an external attack on the United States. And the treaty area includes the South. When Portugal, as a founding member, joined NATO, it was very keen to make sure that the Azores were defined as part of the treaty area. So it's really an imperative then, I think, your setup that underscores the importance of NATO and EU complementarity and working together.
Well, thanks for that. Please, Chloe.
Well, fully agree with Mr. Bell. I mean, I cannot agree more on the fact that actually, if you look at both organizations, they are quite different, but at the same time, they share a large number of members. So when we speak about interest or nations, interest of the nations, actually, these are shared interests, by both organizations. Of course, the question is now more about, for sure, not competition, because nations, they have, limited resources. So when you have a set of capabilities, you put this under a NATO flag or under an EU flag. At the end of the day, you have, as a nation, one set of capability. So the problem is more like how we can organize an efficient sequence of of actions between, or distribute, let's say, the actions between NATO and, or the task between NATO and EU. And here we need to look at what are the areas for complementarity, or to avoid redundancy. And that's very much what is going on when we look at EU and NATO cooperation. Of course, in the security domain, at the moment, there are some obstacles, because in the Med, I mean, for obvious reasons, given the current geopolitical situation, there is a kind of big obstacle. But at the end of the day, there are two organizations that have a lot of interest in common, and for sure, the stability of the Med is, a core interest for both organizations.
I couldn't agree more with you, Chloe, but I think it's probably a real challenge, particularly from a military point of view. And I'm curious, Admiral, as a sailor and someone who's called on to serve in both NATO and EU missions, is there a one that takes primacy over the other, or is this a balancing act that the military forces of NATO and the EU have to work out?
Well, I being the last one to jump in, I think my role is definitely more to speak about the technical military side of the house. And I would just remind everybody, and following also Dr. Clo's points, that both NATO and EU are made by nations. So the real point is not the two organizations competing or being complemented in terms of intervention anywhere, but more like what the nations, and above all those nations which are key actors in their organizations, and all of them, of course, were part of both organizations, they have to make sure to use one or the other according to what's the best suited organization to act according to the crisis they're dealing with. So basically, turning to a technical perspective, what I can say is that NATO members agreed on several occasions that upon EU request, NATO naval and air assets can contribute to EU operations in the areas of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and logistics. So it's my experience as the Chief of Staff in Markham, NATO Markham, that quite frankly, useful lessons can be just taken from the technical side of the house. For instance, in the Gulf, during the Operation Ocean Shield, we had an excellent cooperation together with the EU assets of mission Atalanta and the UN assets, plus quite a sizable number of national assets as well. So that proved to be, I think, a good paradigm in terms of an international effort toward, at that time, a specific crisis, which was the piracy. And I have to say that that's been a successful exercise, because pirates fortunately turned to different business just because of these very, say, coordinated and orchestrated intervention.
Well, thank you for that answer, Admiral. I think maybe we should take a step back and go back to the title of today's event and ask, why does NATO need a southern flank strategy? We've sort of touched on this with Bob Bell's comment. But is this new and only in response to Russian aggression in Crimea? Or does it have older roots in the alliance? Notwithstanding the discussion of the Azores and Portugal, how does the southern flank strategy fit into what we often hear expressed by NATO nations, a 360-degree coverage of alliance territory? And what does the role of a southern flank strategy for the Mediterranean mean for NATO members? Chloe, I saw your hand first.
Yes, so let's say to speak about, NATO literature a bit. So of course, the concept, this is very much linked to the projecting stability agenda. So you know that the concept has been launched at the Warsaw Summit in 2016. And so this is very much the reflect of kind of compromise between among the allies. There was a need to, after the Crimea crisis, to acknowledge that the southern members of the alliance have also some security concerns and priorities that needs to be acknowledged and taken into consideration. And so having this new agenda, the projecting stability one, was a way for all the nations, the NATO nations, to acknowledge that it's about East, but it's also about South. Now, when it comes to let's say, what does it mean in terms of tangible instruments? Actually, it's not really a new strategy. It's a threat-based strategy that has started, straight away after the end of the Cold War. So this projecting stability strategy, you had several, let's say, ages in terms of projecting stability. So this started with, opening towards the Eastern and Central Europe, former, Warsaw Pact members. So it was about prosperity and stability. So, EU and NATO working together to stabilize this region. After that, we had a time that NATO went into a crisis management mission. So we had, of course, Balkans, but also Afghanistan and then Iraq. And so this is probably today a kind of concept that is an umbrella concept in order just to reframe what NATO has been doing, over these 3 decades. This has evolved a lot, but has evolved a lot for a good reason, because, the geopolitical realities in the region has evolved a lot. And so having this kind of, concept is very much flexible. Some people complain about it because it's not really clear, but at the same time, it gives flexibility. Of course, we still need to understand or to agree what do we mean by stability. And so how do we want to project the stability? And so this, the obvious illustration that we don't really have an agreement about that is the fact that we don't have a political concept approved by the NAC for the projecting stability. Now, it doesn't mean that projecting stability, is a different task. Projecting stability, you have elements of projecting stability, in the 3 core tasks of NATO. So you have, of course, the first, defense, collective defense, when it comes to security of the Med. You have elements of crisis management. You have also elements in terms of cooperative security. So at the end of the day, it's more about having a kind of motto and also a strong message to our partners also, because this is very much, let's say, linked to NATO's strategy towards the South, and so it implies that we need to work with partners.
Yes, Robert.
I agree with Chloe completely on all that. I was at Wales, of course, supporting President Obama. The way I would characterize it is that the states along the southern tier, let's say France, Italy, Turkey, just to name 3, came to Wales very focused on the new challenge from the East because of Crimea and Ukraine. And these countries stepped up admirably to that challenge, with each of those countries volunteering to take the lead with a brigade in the rotation for the VJTF, the spearhead force that could get anywhere in a week. They didn't shirk that responsibility whatsoever in terms of the challenge from the East. But in so doing, they were sort of quietly raising their hands and saying, while we're doing this, please don't forget, or let's make sure you don't forget, that NATO has enduring interests to the south. And that's because NATO is an alliance of sovereign nations, and many of the countries along the southern tier have enduring interests to the south. Just two examples. In 2011, the NATO decision to accept the invitation of the United Nations Security Council and intervene militarily in Libya to protect the civilians that were under threat from Gaddafi and Benghazi. That reflected deep historic Italian and French interest in North Africa. Or in 2012, when NATO at the Chicago summit took the difficult decision by consensus to stand up a ballistic missile defense shield for the whole alliance, it was not oriented to the East, it was oriented to the South. In fact, explicitly, NATO made clear it was not aimed at Russia. So the radar, advanced detection radars in southeastern Turkey, the destroyers and cruisers that provide the seaborne missile defense interceptors are based in Spain at Rota. Well before Crimea, NATO was taking major actions that were oriented to the South. And at the Wales Summit, the countries that are most directly engaged in that orientation just wanted to be sure that the squeaky wheel while getting the oil didn't mean that the other wheels got forgotten.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And as we look to the actions that have been taken in response to Ukraine, Crimea, and the eastern portions of Ukraine, it's clear that NATO looked much more broadly to respond to threats in all directions, and including the recent efforts in the North Atlantic to focus attention there. But coming back to the discussion of projecting stability, Chloe, I think you did a really masterful job of explaining why projecting stability, which doesn't seem to be a core task of the alliance, in fact reflects all three of the core tasks quite handily as nations pursue this. And when you look to the South, one of the questions that's been asked by our audience from Paul Sullivan is, how would each of you weigh and consider the different interests and objectives of NATO members with regard to the southern flank, with those of the interests and objectives of the countries on that southern flank? So both the NATO members on the southern flank, but the nations across the Mediterranean who are the source or the location from which many of the challenges are projected. Can we start with you,
part
Bob?
of the challenge here, I think, is terminology. And the word flank, I think, is a bit problematic. During the Cold War, of course, there was a northern flank and a southern flank. And we had the CFE treaty, and Lynn Davis and a bunch of very talented diplomats spent a lot of time negotiating a flank agreement. That was because it was a flank in terms of the contest with the Soviet Union. The interests of NATO to the south are not just a southern flank that's part of a dimension having to do with an increased assertiveness and aggressiveness on the part of Russia, including its military presence in Syria and naval operations in the Med. There are legitimate interests, national security interests of member states of NATO to the south, as I said, that have nothing to do with Russia. And first and foremost is the security dimension of failed states and migration in terms of disruption of the way of life in Europe. The attack of terrorists on Paris in 2015 at the Bataclan, 130 people killed. That was the largest loss of life for France by conflict since World War II on French soil. It could have been Article 5 if France had chosen to go that route. They had the choice, and I respect their choice. They appealed to EU member states to offer military support. But my point is just the word flank kind of distracts from the fact that there are issues to the south that have to do with terrorism, trafficking, failed states, migration. You could make an argument that the United States could have decided under President Obama, but didn't, or under President Trump, to hand off the Defeat ISIS campaign to NATO in the same way that Afghanistan was handed off from a coalition of the willing to ISAF. So there are legitimate threats from the south that have nothing to do with a flank that's facing eastward.
Chloe, please.
Just for the sake of being precise, today in NATO, in a NATO context, we don't anymore use, the southern flank, term or expression, because it sounds a bit aggressive or too military, let's say. And so this is quite important because it reflects the fact that, projecting stability, as I mentioned before, there is no real agreement among the allies about beyond, that the fact that we all want to, let's say, contribute to the stability of North Africa and, let's say, our close or more, or let's say, less close periphery in the south. But at the end of the day, we don't really have an agreement about what it means in terms of, what nature of stability we want to project. How do we project it? What does it mean in terms of ways? So we have an understanding of who are, our partners, because NATO has for a long time partners in the region. We have also an understanding about, for the time being, okay, of the limits of this projecting stability agenda, because it's very much limited by the geography of these partnerships. But at the end of the day, we see today that the South, on the limit of the South, is very much in debate. Look at what the task that the section has given to all the NATO bodies to look at more let's say, or additional engagements in the MENA region, and also to reflect on what are the opportunities for NATO to, let's say, develop any partnership in the Sahel region. So is Sahel a part of the NATO strategy? That's something that the next summit will probably decide or bring some elements of answer. Beyond that, and I very much agree with Mr. Bell, we have strong and, let's say, collective interests that are extremely clear from the treaty perspective. When it comes to the freedom of navigation in the Med, that's clearly something that it's not to be discussed. It's a core task of NATO. When we discuss about, the cables, all these internet cables that are passing through the Mediterranean, that's also something that we need to protect. We have a number of infrastructure that are critical for, the functioning of our nations that needs to be protected, and that's the core task of NATO. we have also the question of how do we deal with the challenge represented by migration flows. I prefer to name it challenge more than threat, because I guess that, you know, the risk is more like to have trafficking terrorist groups trying to weaponize this challenge more than, you know, the migratory flow being a threat by itself. The problem is that if we just push it back to our partners on the shore, on the other shore of the Mediterranean, we would just increase the burden of our partners that are already in a shaky, if you allow me this expression, shaky position, shaky situation before the COVID, after the Arab Spring, but also, you know, for kind of root causes that we all know that first and foremost linked to governance. And so the problem is that if we don't agree on a specific vision, we will keep having, you know, kind of, let's say, suspicions from the other side. Our partners, they are extremely, you know, cautious towards our projecting stability agenda, because sometimes they don't really understand what does it mean, you know. And this is probably something that we need to figure out, to have a coherent and clearer, let's say, agenda that we can promote. And so this is also something that we need to promote to the other international organizations that are working and already present at the ground, and that, of course, we need to partner with.
Okay, and thank you for all of that. The one thing that you said at the beginning of your comment was talking about the change in language and no longer using a military term. But NATO is a military alliance and has military structures and political structures that it applies to the challenges of the entire alliance. But in particular, I want to cite a couple that apply to the MENA region in particular. Considering the Mediterranean, we have the Standing Naval Force. We also have the Hub for the South in Naples. And then in Kuwait, the NATO ICI Regional Center that was established. But the hub has been slow to stand up. There are challenges to get resources committed to the Standing Naval Forces on a regular basis. And the center in Kuwait took a long time to open and still faces a number of challenges to its effective operation. So given that we have structures that are supposed to do certain things to help facilitate NATO's projecting stability role, its interests in the Mediterranean, now we have the pandemic response. We have Russian military activities in the region. We've got the presence of the People's Liberation Army Navy from China in the Mediterranean. How does NATO respond diplomatically, militarily, economically to all of these different threats if our tools are not fully functional or up to the job?
Well, EJ, I think that our tools are adequate for the task. The question is that I think more that states tend to view headquarters and the flags that fly over them as symbols, as a sort of a measuring stick of priority and importance. Since Crimea, of course, NATO has taken the decision to stand up 2 new headquarters, one in Norfolk and one in Germany, to deal with transatlantic sea line of communication issues and mobility issues in Europe. That's a measure of the priority that everyone by consensus came to recognize in these 2 areas. And the headquarters, the creation of the physical place, sort of underscores that priority. When NATO was debating some years ago its reduction in the command structure, and a decision had to be taken on which Joint Forces Command was going to be eliminated to get down to the level that some nations were insisting on, everyone's gaze sort of turned to Joint Force Command Lisbon, much to the dismay of I think, Spain and Portugal. They saw the decision to do away with Joint Force Command Lisbon as a sort of measure of a lack, not a vote of confidence in NATO's prioritization to threats, if you will, from the south. Now, there were some workarounds. Strike Force NATO's headquarters was moved to Lisbon, and Strike Forces NATO is the only naval command, unlike the standing naval fleets, that can actually command carrier-sized task forces. But what NATO's been doing, I think, since that decision to try to reassure the nations on the southern tier that it still prioritizes these threats to the south, is to enhance the importance of Joint Forces Command Naples. And that's in part why the decision was taken to put the hub at JFC Naples.
Yes, Chloe.
I won't comment on the naval group, because obviously that's the ground of the Admiral. But one question or one point that you have raised that is extremely important when it comes to projecting stability in the South in general. So why actually we don't speak anymore about, let's say, southern flank? Because we have clear, let's say, threats in terms of, terrorist activities, trafficking activities, but at the same time, those threats that NATO can address as an organization, but on a very small scale, most of the time there are NATO nations addressing it for political reasons that we all understand. But at the same time, most of the problems, they are linked to causes or root causes that are not purely security related or military. So most of the time, those problems in the South, they are linked to root causes that are social economic imbalances, that are governance, let's say, dysfunctionalities, environmental problems, community, let's say, rivalries, etc., etc. And so for that, the question, and I'm coming back to your first sentence, is that NATO is a military, or let's say political military organization. So what are the tools that NATO has to address these root causes? I would say, not so many. Beyond capacity building, training opportunities, trying to foster interoperability, trying to support the reform of the security or let's say defense sectors of these countries. But the problem is that you need to have a request from these countries, and so in the case of many countries, you understand, we all understand why it's not obviously possible. Even in a context like Iraq, where we have a clear request, the problem is that this is a country where the political authorities, they are quite, let's say, diverse. Let's put it this way. And so the problem is that, okay, we conduct a mission, we try to support, but who are we supporting if you put it in the big picture of the security and defense apparatus in Iraq, for example? So this is a very good question. And so now, beyond these activities that NATO is already conducting with the partners, the problem is that what can NATO do to support organizations that are, dealing with development, let's say stabilization, so all these agencies. And so NATO is, of course, supporting to a certain extent the UN, the African Union, and also the EU. And so what can we do better to support these actors? That's probably, a central question for the NATO 2030 reflection.
That's a good point, and I'll try to come back to that in a moment, but I saw Admiral Lazio raise his hand, so please, sir, go ahead.
Well, I think it's my turn to provide a military angle to your question. And of course, the resources and the fourth generation issues have plagued the alliance at least from the end of the Cold War. As far as I'm concerned, I was dealing with it since 2008, when I ended up for the first time at NATO headquarters. I suffered them directly when dealing with member nations' navies as the Markham Chief of Staff for the Standing Naval Forces, fourth generation cycle. Now, I think the solution can only reside in convincing nations and their navies, by the way, that expanding a major naval unit for 6 months or even a year under NATO command and control would prove beneficial for their maritime forces from the training point of view and effectiveness as well. But even more so, of course, in fostering cohesion and solidarity of the alliance. Perhaps we should seize the opportunity to enhance the capabilities of the Standing Naval Group 2, which is the one operating mainly in the Mediterranean. These precious assets, of course, compete every day with many other national and multinational tasks, and this can only get worse in the coming future. Of course, full implementation of the framework for the South would be a visible sign of a NATO commitment to the Mediterranean. But of course, that will not be enough. So what is enough? I don't know, but for sure, reinforcing the military capabilities of the alliance would enhance NATO credibility in tackling also all the regional challenges that have only a limited military angle. That's at least my view. As you said, this is a political military alliance. In order to be credible, you have to have the right tools. So that's something that we need to stress and to show all our partners and neighbors and the friends operating in the Mediterranean. Of course, given the budgetary impact, a Southern flag strategy would require a potentially difficult to forge political consensus among NATO members. You know that when you are devoting more resources to the southern flank, of course, this requires assigning fewer resources to the east. So that's probably the perception that we should make sure not to provoke among all the NATO members. So the southern flank, to use a military wording, should of course not come to the expense of the rest of the alliance. However, it should be clear that providing the right framework from the Mediterranean side, this provides the alliance the security which they need.
But let me follow up on that, Admiral, because you're now talking about the capacity of navies to respond, to be available, but also to work together. So how will NATO maintain interoperability in an environment that is now menaced by potential cuts to defense budgets based on the COVID crisis? Certainly, it's true that we're not seeing cuts to defense budgets projected in 2021, but there's still a great suspicion that the bill will come due in the out years, the future years, and the effort to field new technologies and integrating those new technologies in with legacy systems. All of this is a training challenge. It's an interoperability challenge. How can the NATO nations continue to work effectively together in this Mediterranean environment?
I think your concern is very well placed, and in fact is everybody's concern. It is my view that interoperability is probably the most relevant tool in the military inventory. It's even more relevant than the hard competed for military capabilities offered to the alliance. The common standards for equipment and procedures are practiced and exercised through, of course, training and operating together. And they are the texture of our military capability. Actually, the same NATO procedures properly adapted are in fact a baseline of communication, even with the non-partner navies at sea. So that goes even beyond NATO scope. As you asked, how can we ensure that we keep this interoperability? Well, I think the best suited tool is the approval of the STANAX publications, the standards which are agreed at NATO headquarters with a periodic cycle, which make sure that even the most advantaged technological countries do not run, leaving the, let's say, less ambitious allies with difficulty in reaching up. That's done continuously in a cycle in NATO headquarters. Of course, the tensions between, say, the more technological and less ambitious allies are eased in Brussels, but it's even more important that tactical procedures are regularly updated and practiced in NATO exercises. And you know that we have a very strong and successful training cycle we do every year, not only in the naval, of course, naval and air domain, well, that's the one that I know better. And again, even more relevant than the training itself is the lessons learned process that we established after every exercise. So it's a three-pronged approach. In NATO headquarters in Brussels, we make sure the standards are set and accepted by all the allies. Then during the training and exercises, we practice with the equipments to make sure that they are in fact interoperable. And with the lessons learned process, we make sure that every issue which didn't go according to our own expectations is solved, tackled by the single nations which might have an issue, or the group of nations which want to jump in. That goes quite well, according to my own experience. And in fact, that's the reason why we still are successful, not only for NATO itself, as I said before, but also in projecting our own procedure and standards to operation outside the NATO area of operation.
Oh, thank you. That's a very comprehensive response to my question, Admiral. And Bob Bell.
Yeah, EJ, I just wanted to pick up on Chloe's excellent point about the importance, particularly in projecting stability operations, to connect the means with the ends, if you will. There's a famous equation that's taught in Army war colleges. Colonel, you may have been taught this as well, that strategy equals ends plus ways plus means. And let's just take as an example the defeat ISIS operations in Syria. This little chart, which is mind-boggling, from NATO shows the 82 nations around the world that are part of the global coalition. It's not a NATO operation. It's a coalition of the willing. But when President Trump was elected, he said NATO was obsolete because it wasn't engaged in the fight on terror. So the states that had been reluctant to give NATO a seat at the table in the coalition to defeat ISIS somewhat reluctantly agreed that NATO in its own right would join this coalition. Before that, when there were defense ministerial meetings in Brussels, we would just piggyback on the ministerial and have the other ministers from other parts of the world come into the NATO headquarters for a defeat ISIS meeting, but you would have to take the NATO emblem down off the wall to make the point that it wasn't a NATO mission. But then, as I said, at President Trump's insistence, NATO came into the political military consultation of that global coalition. So it was in that context, NATO at the table, France, Germany, Italy, the Dutch, the Danes, the Canadians, the Belgians, the Norwegians, the Spanish, the Brits, together with New Zealand and Australia, all in this core warfighting group, that when President Trump, in his famous phone call with President Erdogan, decided impetuously to pull the US forces out of the coalition in Syria with no consultation with any of the 82 members, including NATO or the core group, that President Macron said NATO's in danger of being brain dead in his famous, or some think infamous, different views on this, his interview with The Economist. And President Macron was not talking about NATO intellectual capacity or its strategy for Russia. It was saying, how can you have a strategy that requires an end, defeating ISIS, ways, which is military capabilities, strike aircraft, troops on the ground, and means political consultation. How can that work if NATO's part of it when the leader of the coalition with no consultation pulls its troops out? So it's more than just where are the headquarters and what standing fleets do we have? That's one essential element of the strategy equals ends, ways, and means equation. But the means part of it, the political consultation, which involves trust and sort of an investment in multilateralism, are just as important as the military capabilities and the headquarters structures.
Thank you. That's a great reminder of one of the true strengths of the alliance and the consultations that take place around the conference tables. And that leads me to one of our questions from the audience, a name that Robert, you'll recognize, Rick Froh, has asked, because we've been talking about NATO and its operations in the Mediterranean region, he points out that there are other organizations as well that should be considered. And we've talked about the EU, and Chloe started to mention some of the others, the UN, African Union, Arab League. They all have a role in promoting security and stability in the MENA region, and therefore have an impact on the Mediterranean and NATO interests. How should the alliance be interacting with these various organizations? Do they currently do enough of that, or is there something more or better to be done in this area? Chloe.
So actually, just following up and answering your question, but following up on the comments of the Admiral and Mr. Bell, I guess that interoperability is key and is part of the answer, or as part of the solution to the capacity generation problem. And as Mr. Bell rightly pointed, interoperability should not be, let's say, look at or considered solely from the within the alliance perspective, meaning that interoperability is key because we could share the burden with our partners in the Med. So maybe strengthening their capabilities on the other side of the Mediterranean, other shore, would be also a solution to share the burden, and it's already something that is happening. We have, of course, a cooperation, for example, with Moroccan forces, naval forces. So this could be something that we can try to work on and develop. At the same time, interoperability is key. Why? Because you could not have, built this coalition against Daesh in that short period of time without having interoperability among, NATO nations, but also partners. And so this very much relies on standardization first, but also, you have this, let's say, 3 layers of interoperability. So it's about, of course, technologies and capabilities, but it's also about procedures. And finally, it's about, let's say, human interoperability. So how much our partners, they are able to speak our language, or we are able to speak their language beyond the purely linguistic barriers, let's say. And so here I see a very unique role that NATO can play in disseminating good practices in terms of professional military education, this expertise in training and advising, let's say, security forces of our partner countries. This is probably a role that NATO can play. And what would be, for me, the second step would be that now we have trained a lot, our partners, we have deployed mobile training teams, they are already having a lot of opportunities in other medical school, in the NATO Defense College, etc. And so this is also part of the reason why we established this ICI center in Kuwait. Now, what would be the next step for me in terms of, achieving interoperability with our partners in the South would be how we transform these partners into security consumer to security provider, and how do we try to foster, the transfer of good practices or, experiences among the partners themselves. And so this, for example, if you look at Mauritania, what could be the role of Mauritania as a NATO partner? They could transfer to the other G5 Sahel countries their own experience, what they learned from NATO. This could be an example. If you think about the Gulf, having NATO can support the GCC in developing the command and control capabilities for the collective, force. Now they are trying to reinforce their anti-ballistic defense. And so in that way, NATO can play a role in advising them. Why not trying to foster interoperability among the naval forces in the Gulf to have their own mechanism? I know that the US, they're already there and trying to do that. But at the end of the day, it could be also an area where NATO has a role.
Great. Bob?
Yeah, absolutely. Chloe's exactly right. Ambassador Doug Lude, who I worked for at NATO, pushed very hard without success for a much more formal relationship between NATO and the Gulf states in terms of command structures and interoperability potential. And this really comes back to the person who asked this question, Colonel Rick Froh, one of the real unsung heroes, if you will, at NATO, as you know well, EJ, because we think of interoperability at the high end. Can NATO member states F-16s be part of a strike formation with an F-16 from the UAE, which was the case, by the way, in Libya. The first UAE F-16 strike was flown by a UAE female pilot. And can we standardize the vertical launch system launchers on our surface combatants so that we can get an exponentially stronger capability in terms of anti-missile defense from ships, not just in NATO navals, but our navies, but our partners. But what Rick really focused on and was so brilliant at was focusing on the interoperability of the individual soldier. And so much of NATO's outreach to partnerships, particularly in Africa and in the Middle East, is not so much the high-end conflict spectrum, but at the low end, helping the African Union train individual foot soldiers who, in small numbers, can have strategic effect. And this is really where Rick was so focused in terms of the equipment, the training, the doctrine, the practices, the interoperability between NATO and partner nations in other regions at that individual soldier level.
Oh, thank you for that. That's a great reminder. Admiral.
I was just listening, of course, to my fellow panelists. To a certain extent, we have to be careful in managing expectations in terms of interoperability with all the partners and even non-partners operating in the Mediterranean and surrounding area. Of course, it's quite a lengthy and challenging process. But what I would like to say on a positive remark is that from the naval perspective, actually it's already quite ongoing and rather well. We have to consider the NATO approach not only as a, let's say, NATO-led approach, but also as a NATO national approach toward our own partners and other operating countries in the area. What I mean is that every nation which is part of NATO, when operating with its partners, provides some of the NATO interoperability issues to the exercising partner. So that's a complex, in fact, event. And as long as all the NATO allies are, let's say, very well tuned into their own scope to produce this kind of interoperability with all the other nations facing the Mediterranean. This process, although rather slowly, and sometimes I understand with some kind of difficulty in understanding, but still is ongoing and is going towards the right direction. So let's make sure that we remember that NATO nations can do a lot of good, not necessarily under NATO leadership, but according to NATO policy. That's what we're doing. Last point is defense capacity building. That's the other side of the coin, of course. It's exercising pretty much technical, but with strategic effects. And at the same time, the capacity building efforts we do, both as NATO itself, which we're doing in several of these countries at the moment, but also as a NATO national effort as well. As long as it's tuned on the same frequency, that goes in the right direction.
Well, that actually leads to an opportunity to bring in another audience question, and this is from David Stafford. He says that recently Secretary Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, talked about mutual defense cooperation agreements with Greek aircraft and U.S. aircraft flying, acting as guarantors of stability in the southern Mediterranean. Can we talk maybe about how the NATO hub in Naples can link with the expeditionary sea base that is talked about being established at Suda Bay? How will training and exercising be affected or not by this new arrangement? Yes, Chloe.
So maybe there is a small nuance or distinction that we need to have in mind here. So the hub is collocated in GFC Naples, but is totally separated or independent for the MILCAP bodies or divisions in GFC Naples. So actually the hub per se does not deliver trainings in that, like DCP trainings. That's the MILCAP task. The hub is mainly in charge of developing knowledge about what's going on in the region, trying to look, by the way, beyond the strict NATO south borders. So, looking to Sahel, looking further to the south to sub-Saharan countries. What are the dynamics? What are the instability drivers? And so to, let's say, increase our situational awareness. But in terms of, let's say, trainings and effect, and they're not doing anything. They are trying to expand the NATO community in terms of outreach, engaging with academics, think tanks, NGOs, but also countries that are not NATO partners. But they are not involved into this, shape cooperative security activities.
Thank you for the clarification. Admiral, I saw your hand.
Well, I just wanted to support what Dr. Berger was saying. Naples, in terms of hub and JFC, has a role which is definitely operational and strategic to a certain extent, while making sure that you get the best out of the exercises, both bilateral and multilateral, is something that the Maritime Command in Northwood is taking care of, and that goes throughout the alliance, and that includes the Mediterranean. When NATO decided to build on a single component command in terms of maritime, it's in Northwood, as you well know, that was making sure that within the headquarters you had all the expertise from the various regions to make sure that you make best use of training opportunities to stabilize some situations. And obviously one could be the one going on in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. That's something that is followed very, very professionally and very carefully. And although sometimes it's a national responsibility to have a bilateral exercise, nevertheless, there is a very good linkage. All the nations and navies are represented in Markham. So that's the way which ensures a level of consistency in what we are doing.
Thank you, Admiral. We touched on very briefly Libya, and I'd like to go back to a question that's been posed by Callum Patton. He's asked, how much has the Libya problem, or how much has Libya proven to be a problem for NATO, specifically in the context of NATO's mission in the Mediterranean, or NATO's coverage of Mediterranean interests, and particularly asking to bring in the Turkey angle. How has Turkey's obstruction of any meaningful NATO engagement, in his words here, in Libya to enforce an arms embargo affected NATO interests in the Mediterranean? In fact, first question, I guess, would be, is that an accurate statement of the problem? And if not, why not?
Well, it requires us to plunge into very sensitive areas if we're going to talk about this now. I mean, obviously, it's a challenge for NATO. It's a challenge for NATO because you have member states who are sitting around the table at the NAC that are backing different factions in an ongoing conflict. And ideally, you could use the NAC for political consultation, or perhaps Secretary General mediation, to try to straighten out the differences. But since NATO is not directly engaged in a mission in Libya now, that ended in 2011, it's not a core interest of the alliance. That I think that the Libya operation, there's frankly, I think there's a misperception in some of the media, some of the academic literature about NATO's role there. NATO responded, of course, to an invitation from the United Nations Security Council for states individually or together in regional organizations to intervene using military force to deal with the threat to the civilians in Benghazi. It was at a point where, because of Rwanda in particular, the doctrine of responsibility to protect was very much on people's minds. There was some doubt about whether NATO was the right instrument to be in North Africa. France originally argued that NATO's brand was not good in North Africa and it would be counterproductive. But then the Arab League requested that NATO come in, and 4 North African countries joined the NATO strike operations. That operation was carried out under oversight of the UN Security Council. There were terms in the Security Council resolution for conflict termination. Gaddafi was given multiple exit ramps if he had chosen to settle it in a political context. He chose not to. In the end, of course, the conflict enabled dissidents and those who had been oppressed in Libya to take the opportunity for regime change. But when NATO had finished its part, it terminated the operation and reported back to the UN Security Council that it had done what it had been asked to do. And there was a whole mechanism in place under UN oversight that was supposed to then pick up the pieces. That failed, and failed miserably, and Libya is still a failed state. But the impression, I think, still exists that NATO went in, broke the China. It was NATO's responsibility then to do nation building in Libya and sort it all out. And that's just not the terms of reference by which the NAC decided to go in. And the NAC concluded that it had done its part and terminated the operation.
Yes, Chloe.
So here I'm very much speaking as Chloe, as you know, a totally independent academic. That's my personal view. I could not agree more with Mr. Bell. Actually, when we come back to unified protector operation, I guess that NATO did what was requested. When people complain about, okay, NATO left the country without an exit strategy. The problem is that NATO received the mandate for a specific sequence in this, world campaign, military campaign. The problem is that after that, okay, the UNSMIL, so the UN mission was established, and so the exit strategy was supposed to be achieved through this UNSMIL instrument. We all understand that the situation in Libya has nowadays very much evolved. If you look back to 2011 and what is the situation in Libya now, the situation is totally different. The nature of the conflict has totally evolved. So we had, let's say, a civil war that turned into an international conflict. And so the problem is that in 2011 and after, NATO was possibly, there was a possible role for NATO to support UNSMIL, and NATO has made it very clear that it stands by and ready to support UNSMIL, and at a time when UNSMIL needed to be evacuated from Tripoli. Actually, NATO was ready to support, to protect UNSMIL. The problem is that NATO has also discussed and offered help regarding the security sector and different sector reform. But actually, the Libyan authorities, and so here, when it comes to the Libyan authorities, we need also to acknowledge that they are not one single authority that you can dialogue with, and that's part of the problem. So the Libyan authorities, they received actually many offers. So you have a plan or an initiative that has been submitted by the EU. You have a NATO proposal. And so you have also several national strategy or national, offers from NATO nations, but also from nations outside the NATO community. So this is pretty much what is the the status when it comes to NATO, okay, as an organization. Now, when it comes to the alliance, the problem is that the conflict has evolved into an international conflict where you have different nations involved. And so the Libyan question now is not anymore about, a political settlement of the Libyan crisis. And so this is the problem. What can NATO do, even in terms of security, sector reform and the support of NATO? What can NATO do when we are speaking of a conflict that, has took or reach a stage where it's not anymore about, finding a political solutions among the Libyans. You know what I mean? So that's the main problem. Now we are speaking about an international conflict in Libya that have regional implications, huge regional implications, of course, in the Med, but also further to the south. You cannot, expect to solve the Sahel question today if you don't solve the Libyan crisis. And, that's this, let's say, Russian, purpose. If you know what I mean, that's part of the conundrum. So of course the Libyan issues has a huge impact for the alliance. For NATO as an organization, as Mr. Bell said, NATO did its part. What is an implication and still something that we need to work on is the impact in terms of image after the Libyan campaign. And so the campaign has a very detrimental impact in terms of for the NATO image among the partners in North Africa and more, largely in let's say the MENA region. And so
okay, so
Stratcom, that's probably something that the NATO as an organization can work on.
So let's take it back into the discussion of the region and Sahel and what happens with security and development, because we left that and I told you we would come back to the question that you were addressing earlier on development. Yusuf Toby has asked, the nexus between security and development is paramount, and if the Sahel becomes a priority for NATO, how does linking the development policies with security policies work? And since the G5 Sahel have clearly stated that this is essential to success in the region.
Yeah, I think I might take the first shot at that because I'm going to say something about France, and Chloe's got to maintain her academic impartiality. You know, France has significant national interest in that region, particularly in Mali, just to name one place. France turned to the EU essentially and asked EU member states to understand the depth of French interest in the military operations that were going on there in terms of threats of terrorism and other things that could come to Europe. France was not very happy, to put it mildly, with the amount of support they got from the EU side in terms of those operations in Africa, North Africa. And the United States sort of stepped in with an almost unprecedented level of cooperation between AFRICOM and French command structures in these operations. And in fact, Minister Le Drian commented publicly on sort of a high watermark in U.S.-French military cooperation, you know, going back maybe to World War II, because of the support, the mutual support, and from the U.S. side that included ISR and special forces and air refueling. And so in a sense, in a bilateral way between AFRICOM and Paris, these operations are being conducted to the maximum extent with the means available. But it wasn't France's first choice in terms of how this would do. France wanted more positive response from the EU. So in this context, I can't imagine it evolving in a direction where NATO then says, well, we'll step in and take Mali as a NATO operation or mission. I think the best we can expect, unless Europe wants to start doing more in North Africa through CSDP, which they can and should, and I would support, is to hope that whoever the next American president is, and whatever decision is taken on what happens to AFRICOM headquarters in Germany, that this bilateral US-French cooperation in the Sahel with support of the Sahel G5 continues as it is.
Chloe.
So, honestly, I fully agree. Again, as Gray, I fully agree with Mr. Bell. It's I guess we all understand that Sahel is, and Mali is for France, you know, a special area. So France was keen, and by the way, Barkhane is supported by Spain and by some German elements to you know, to a certain extent. So even though it's a national operation, there are some, you know, some European allies supporting France in that. Now you have this 4-pillar strategy that has been developed by the EU. So in the EU context, of course, the first pillar, it's about counterterrorism, and this is very much relying on the cooperation between France and the US. Second and third pillar, it's about securitization and stabilization. So this is conducted in an EU context. And so the last one is about development, and this is fully EU with the help of other organizations, so trying to involve ECOWAS, but also African Union. So honestly, in this context, in the Sahel context, I don't see any place for NATO, but you know, the support to Mauritania, and so through Mauritania, which is a Mediterranean dialogue partner, the expansion of opportunities in terms of professional military education for other G5 Sahel countries. And this is clear, I mean, this is not secret, that it's quite a kind of something that is in discussion at the HQ at the moment. So there is a NATO concern and legitimate concern about what's going on in Sahel. But when it comes to what we can do, it's on a very small scale, because NATO members are already there and doing things in an EU context or in national context, and so they're quite happy with that. Now, NATO has developed for a few years now cooperation with African Union. If we speak very frankly, it's politically speaking, it's quite important, and I guess the dialogue needs to be sustained and probably deepen. There is also on the, let's say, tactical or practical level, it's quite modest at the moment. It's about airlifting, and even we are not speaking about so much. Occasions that it happened that NATO provided support to the African Union. Nevertheless, African Union has showed during the last years, and so 2 last years, that there is an ambition. Okay, something was locked for this. I mean, it was about regional tension. Something is going better and better within the African Union. Comeback return of Morocco to the organization. So this is opening new avenues for African Union to play a bigger role and more efficient role in the continent. And so in that, NATO can for sure support, again, like the GCC, NATO can for sure, bring its unique expertise in terms of interoperability. And so, of course, African Union, to stabilize the continent, needs to have troops to be deployed in stabilization mission. And so for that, in coordination with UN, with EU, because they are already there and playing a big role, and for now, years, of course, NATO can bring his specific expertise in trying to develop interoperability or foster interoperability among the forces in the region to be placed under the African Union umbrella.
Thank you for that, Chloe. That still leaves me a little bit confused, though, about about NATO's approach to the Mediterranean and the MENA region in general. There are a lot of challenges, and you've quite rightly pointed out that many of them are not the traditional security challenges, or not able to be addressed with the traditional political military tools of the alliance. And yet the region continues to challenge member nations, member states, with the problems that we've already mentioned. We've talked about migrant flows. We've talked about inequality on both sides of the Mediterranean. And we haven't mentioned, but the fact that the populations of the MENA region tend to be a lot younger and also more educated than they've ever been, and therefore with greater aspirations, and yet an inability to realize those aspirations, leading to migrant flows, whether they're legal immigration or illegal immigration into the European region, that are placing a strain on the nations of the northern side of the Mediterranean. And to some extent, the governments are able to handle this, but to other extents, they haven't been able, and have requested assistance. They've requested assistance from the EU, they've requested assistance from the United Nations, and they've requested assistance from NATO. So as we look at the challenges in the region, notwithstanding what we've just said about trying to address development and the solutions that treat the root causes where they lie, how does NATO assist its member nations to stand up to the challenges that they're facing on their own territories? So, Bob, would you like to tackle that first?
Well, can I ask EJ if you could focus the question on exactly how you want the member states, or what you're asking is the art of the possible with regard to individual member states?
Sure. The individual member states are facing migratory flows that are also accompanied by illegality, whether that's smuggling, smuggling in people, smuggling in goods, smuggling in drugs. And all of these are placing burdens on the governments of the northern side of the Mediterranean to respond. We've seen the challenges that were addressed with German help to collaborate with Greece and Turkey on the migrant flows then. But what else can be done to help France, Italy, Spain, who are also facing migrant flows?
Well, I think first and foremost, this is a first order of business for the EU. The EU is at risk of being torn apart over this issue. The previous effort with the quota allocations and the Dublin Agreement failed. The Commission has now put forward a new proposal that says, in effect, EU member states that are unwilling to accept a quota allocation of migrants can, in effect, get out of that obligation if they assume financial and logistics responsibility for deporting an equivalent number of migrants who are denied asylum. Whether that new Commission proposal is going to find consensus within the EU is not clear. Some member states to the east who do not like the quotas have said it doesn't go far enough, but it may be the only game in town, it to be determined. NATO's role, as impressive as the agreement was that was reached under the auspices of Ursula von der Leyen when she was German defense minister at that NATO defense ministerial between Greece and Turkey. That was an impressive bit of statesmanship. And it sort of shows the value of NATO in a political consultation, sort of mediation sense. Both Turkey and Greece, historically antagonistic, both see purpose in having NATO there to sort of provide a means for compromise sometimes. And the fact that Germany was able to get those two countries together and come up with this plan to use the NATO standing naval fleet in the Med to provide a sort of ISR function to assist with the migrant situation. It was an impressive bit of work. But you have to understand at the same time how limited the NATO role was. The NATO ships were not picking up migrants. They weren't taking migrants back. They weren't blocking migrants. What NATO agreed to do was to be an ISR platform, in effect, using their surveillance capabilities and to pass information on to Frontex and to the national naval forces of the EU member states where the migrants were headed. So NATO's role was very much an auxiliary role. And the real key to that was the decision of the EU to, in effect, pay Turkey a tremendous amount of money to keep migrants in Turkey. Turkey uses that agreement from time to time to remind the EU that it has leverage in some of these ongoing discussions. So to the extent NATO can play a role, I think it has to go with the sort of root sources of the migration. To the extent that capacity building, partnerships in the Med dialogue, Mediterranean dialogue in that region can help prevent failed states and build stability in countries without getting into nation building. It may have some moderating effect on the flow of migrants, but it's always going to be on the margins, and the main role is still going to rest with the EU.
Let me go to the Admiral first, and then I'll give Chloe the last word.
I certainly recognize that NATO is just one of the organizations that might be involved into tackling the Mediterranean challenges. But my main point is that, first of all, I think NATO has to acknowledge, and when I say acknowledge, I do not mean formally acknowledge, but intensively acknowledge that the what we call the southern flank in the beginning of this discussion, it does pose a set of unique challenges to the alliance. And of course, there are no simple answers to complex situations. I do acknowledge that, for instance, there is the recent activation of the JFC Norfolk and the joint support and enabling command in Ulm in Germany, which provided, of course, the alliance with very good resources or tools, but they risk, of course, in a shift in perception of challenges of nowadays into more Cold War patterns. So what I would be my personal plea is, while we make stronger structures to make sure that we can tackle those challenges coming from state actors, at the same time, we do have to acknowledge that our own security is pretty much tied to what happens in the Mediterranean. So JFC Naples is doing a great job. The hub is working, is effective, but of course it needs to be resourced. So let's make sure that NATO resources all the headquarters and tackles all the challenges to make sure that our security stays as good as has been in the last 50 and more years.
Thank you. That's a great reminder, Admiral. Chloe, please.
So beyond the direct threat posed by migration in the Med, so the question is, what can NATO do, for example, to to prevent that flows to reach actually the Med? And so, of course, we have partners, in all this region, and so they are more or less the gates. So the problem is that in supporting our partners, and so what we can do probably is to support them in terms of border control, and we have done that, for example, with Mauritania. But beyond that, there is something also that we need to acknowledge. The problem is that if you look at what are the highways, let's say, or the roads for these flows, the problem is that you have no cooperation, from west to east among these countries. North African countries, they have a tendency to cooperate with their southern neighbors, or to have link because there are, conflicts on their southern borders. So if you look at what are the dynamics, they are very much actually south to north, because actually there is no relations, okay, or no flows, because the borders they are just closed from the west to the east. And the problem is that how do you want to control these flows if actually these countries on the shore of the Mediterranean, they are not talking to each other. So they're just looking, further to south, even when in terms of their own interests, how they see their, own political or geopolitical scope of influence. Everything is about relations to north and to south, but nothing about, west to east. And so you have Mauritania as closest borders with Morocco, and so the problem is that you cannot just, control the borders if actually you have this this mechanism that is, horizontal, that is not functioning. So NATO could have a role in leading, kind of initiating a dialogue about borders control, or kind of, how to establish a regional mechanism among these countries. And so this could be something that NATO under the, let's say NATO +7, the Med dialogue, multilateral format. It could be a question that NATO puts on the table. I'm not
Okay,
so
Chloe, I'm going to have to stop you there. It's a fascinating direction you've taken us in, and you've really hit on something I think that we should probably make a topic for a future webinar and talk about how to solve these East-West relational challenges in the MENA region. I want to thank our panelists today for a fascinating, wide-ranging discussion. We've really covered quite a broad spectrum of topics under the title of today's event. Your insights and experience have been fundamental to the discussion today. I want to equally thank our listeners for their attention and questions. I appreciate the questions that we've been able to introduce into the discussion. My apologies to those of you who had questions that haven't been directly addressed in today's discussion. We do appreciate your taking the time to listen and to pose those questions. We produce this content for all of you who've listened in today, and we welcome your comments after the webinar to improve future webinars. As a reminder, and some of your questions go to this, there is a third and final event in this series, Security in the Mediterranean, the Russia Factor. It will take place on the 20th of October at 10 a.m. And listeners can sign up on our website, www.iiss.org. And lastly, the final webinar in a second tripartite series on defense and security implications of COVID-19, countering China's influence, will take place on the 22nd of October, also at 10 a.m. So please sign up and join us if you can. With that, thank you all and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye now.